Welcome to today's webinar on Capital Facilities Planning under the Growth Management Act. This webinar is brought to you by the Washington State Department of Commerce, Growth Management Services, and the Public Works Board. This will be the first of two webinars on capital facilities planning. This webinar will cover the basics of capital facilities planning under the GMA and introduce the new CFP Guidebook. The second webinar, which will be held on December 2nd at 10 a.m., will focus on the how-to aspects of putting together a capital facilities plan. A separate invite to that webinar will be sent soon. Your presenters today, if technology is on my side, will be Dave Anderson, Planning Review Team Manager for Growth Management and Manager of our Spokane office.
I can't hear Joyce. No, I'm not getting any.
Dave can't hear me. Dave, I can hear you. Dave is the Planning Review Team Manager for Growth Management, and he's also the manager of our Spokane office. I'm Joyce Phillips, a Senior Planner with Growth Management Services.
No.
Also, I would just ask folks to bear with us. This is our first webinar using Link as our webinar platform, and we're still working out a couple of technical challenges. Hopefully this will be something that will work well for us to convey information to large groups of people in the future, though. I just want to leave this slide up for a moment so that you can write down Lynn's email address in case you might need it later. This webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on our website approximately a week after the webinar. Hopefully all participants are in listen-only mode with the exception of Dave Anderson in our Spokane office. During the webinar, if you have any questions, those can be emailed to Lynn at the address on the screen, lynn.con@commerce.wa.gov. For our webinar agenda today, we'll be going through this presentation and we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. We'll give an overview of capital facilities planning as well as an introduction to some of the content in the new Capital Facilities Planning Guidebook. We will reserve time at the end for questions and answers. Some acronyms that I may use during this presentation include CFP for Capital Facilities Plan, GMA for Growth Management Act, UGA for Urban Growth Area, and LOS for Level of Service Standards. If you're not on mute, could you please mute yourselves? Thank you.
Did you mute us? 1, 2, try to unmute.
Sounds like some people are having difficulties getting audio. I will let you know that if you can't participate fully today due to technical challenges, we will have this posted on our website in about a week. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually get started on some of the content. Some of the major types of capital facilities are included on this slide. Sometimes it feels like all of these and more can get jumbled together. It can feel overwhelming and outside of the context of what planners are used to dealing with on a daily basis. One or more of these may be under the purview of a special purpose district and feel like it's even more outside of your control. But in actuality, we do deal with all of these topics pretty regularly. And there are people with expertise in each of these areas that you can work with. They are your partners in helping put together the capital facilities plan, whether they work for a city, a county, or a special purpose district. The Capital Facilities Guidebook covers the issues we'll be discussing today in more detail. It includes statutory references, guidance from the Washington Administrative Code known as the WAC or rules, and also hearings board case summaries. It also includes references and in many cases links to local government examples. Here's the web link to where we have the Capital Facilities Planning Guidebook on our website for those of you who choose to download this webinar later. Because capital facilities are not specifically defined in the GMA, we do recommend that each jurisdiction define capital facilities and identify which of them are necessary to support development. We recommend that at a minimum, local governments consider the RCW, the WAC, hearings board decisions for guidance, as well as the definitions in the GMA for public facilities, urban governmental services, rural governmental services, and with the guidance from the hearings board cases. That's covered in more detail in the introduction section of the guidebook. So Dave can hear us at this point. I'm not sure. Dave, did you want to take a stab at trying to say anything about this slide? I'm not sure if we can hear you.
Okay, are you hearing me?
Yes, great. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, super. Yeah, this is a section of the administrative rules that cover some element of capital facilities, and it was actually one of the major topics in the rule on, when we developed the rule, was how do you go about showing that you can provide adequate facilities, and what is the proper connection between the growth strategy defined in your land use element and the capital facilities plan. And this is covered in a number of places. It is covered a great deal in the section on urban densities, part 3, that covers urban densities, urban growth areas, and countywide planning policies. It's also covered in the section part 8 on implementation, especially the sections on concurrency and impact fees, which really discuss how do you go about showing project consistency, and how do you go about assuring that your local project review procedures are adequately connected back in with your capital facilities planning activities. Go to the next slide. So when you look at what is in the requirements for a comprehensive plan element, these are the basic requirements as they're listed out in the RCW. There's the inventory, there's the forecast, there's an assessment of needs, there's a financing plan, and then there is this requirement that if funding falls short, there's this reassessment process where one goes about assuring that you maintain this consistency and this connection between your financing plan and what the public facilities you're able to finance and the land use element that's generating the demand for those facilities. So those are the basic requirements that are in the statute as they're laid out. We're going to go through each of these individually. Next slide.
Okay, so for the inventory, most jurisdictions already have some sort of an inventory to work with, at least for the infrastructure that's owned by the jurisdiction. Make sure that the information is current and accurate. You'll need to work with all involved departments and special purpose districts to compile the information. Some of the tips for getting the information from service providers is to start early, give them plenty of time to put together the information. Let them know the type of information you want and why. If they don't have the information, there may be opportunities to help them gather the data or get it into a format that's most helpful to you. Also, offer any assistance you can give. Even sharing the types of data you have can help them organize their data in a way that will be more helpful for both of you. And then check to make sure they're using the same population projections, planning horizons, and service boundaries to the extent possible. That just helps make sure that everyone's working towards the same outcomes. As far as the forecast goes, when you're forecasting, you can use the adopted level of service or other measurement mechanism to determine what will be needed to meet the future projected demand. Ideally, the capital facilities element then would define capital facilities, identify those necessary to support development, and clearly state the adopted level of service and any other assumptions the jurisdiction is using for those facilities. Part of identifying and forecasting future needs is planning to correct any existing deficiencies or problems. Local governments, including special purpose districts, should strive to obtain the level of service for all areas. Unserved or underserved areas should be brought up to the minimum standards enjoyed by the rest of the community. That's something that could significantly impact the needed improvements that are necessary. Growth can cause increased need in a couple of different ways. One is related to the increase in the number of people, which is population and employment growth. The other is through expansion of the footprint of the urban growth area or geographic area If you're not in listen-only mode, or if you haven't muted yourself, please do so. These distinctions in how and where growth might occur are central to managing the infrastructure costs in your community. The forecast analysis should identify any projected level of service shortfall. Additional facilities or services may be needed, or the LOS must be lowered. Both options have implications that should be part of the discussion with the public and throughout the decision-making process. When estimating or projecting costs for facilities and services over the life of the plan, it's critical to include costs associated with long-term operation and maintenance of the existing systems, including any significant repairs and replacement if it's needed during the planning horizon. Improvements necessary to support new growth, such as capacity expansion and new facilities, and then any improvements needed to address existing deficiencies. The costs of maintenance and system preservation for both the existing systems and any additions should be factored into the long-term costs. These should be included in a forecast of future needs. All right, Dave.
Yeah. When you're talking about a forecast of future needs, one of the things to keep in mind is where do needs come from? And part of the challenge in a capital facilities planning process is always how do you tie where needs come from back into the individual projects? And there's really three places that needs come from. What is it that causes something to be needed? The first is you've got to hang on to the system you have, and you've got to make the system. You've got investments that you need to continue to maintain the system you have, and those typically come from an asset management system, where that keeps track of chronic repair needs and keeps track of the life cycle of the facilities you have. You've got existing deficiencies, which are parts of your system that simply need to be upgraded, either to meet your existing goals and policies, or to meet external management, or to meet external management mandates, such as perhaps your municipal stormwater permit or other things. Those constitute upgrades you need to make your existing system, not because they're falling apart or because they need maintenance, but because they need to meet new demands, or needs that result from new growth. And these are the needs that are required because of your growth strategy in order to meet new demand. Those come from the interplay between your growth forecast, both in terms of its amount of growth and its location, and also the level of service standards that you've adopted. Those generate the needs resulting for new growth. All of these together end up in the process of implementation, which involves selecting and scoping individual projects, identifying funding sources, or looking at management programs or regulations to help manage the demand for growth. But the thing is, every project that's ultimately built is probably some combination of these different needs. And the important thing is that where the need comes from drives what the eligible funding source is. So, for example, system development charges or impact fees can generally be used to support new growth, but they can't be used for existing deficiency upgrades or system preservation. On the other hand, a number of state and federal grant programs can be used to fund either existing deficiencies or system preservation, but can't be used to fund new growth. So this is why it's important, as you're doing project development and project scoping, that you're keeping track of the information flow through from where the need for the project came from, back through the scoping process and down into project development, scoping, and finance. Next slide.
Okay, great. And Dave, I think that last slide is a key aspect of capital facilities planning, one of the main takeaways from this presentation, I believe. So while the GMA does require a 6-year financing plan be adopted and be realistic, it does not diminish the local government's responsibility to develop a financing plan that looks over the life of the plan. I think local governments should determine which revenues will pay for the capital facility needs. It's one of the hardest parts, but it's also a critical feature in the development of your capital facilities plan. The financing plan should include revenues and costs and prioritize projects. It should determine when capital facility projects will generally occur. The timing of capital projects is a complex mix of factors, including when the project is needed and why, its priority relative to other projects, when funds are available, and the phasing needed to implement the project. It's worth noting that a plan that identifies projects and then labels the funding source as other or grant is a plan that will not likely be implemented fully or in the time frame depicted. Use of local funds, such as utility fees and capital reserves, will be necessary and should be considered when looking for funding sources. Grants can be assumed for partial funding, but we do recommend that jurisdictions be realistic about the amount of grants and the timing and funding sources that they believe they'll be able to use in the implementation of their plans. Local governments do have the option of modifying the capital facilities element to reflect changes in conditions or circumstance, or to delete or add projects in light of current conditions as part of the amendments or periodic update under the GMA. Revenue projections for years 7 through 20 should be included in the jurisdiction's assessment of its ability to provide capital facilities planned for within the planning horizon. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges of the capital facilities plan. The hearings boards have consistently read the Growth Management Act to require that estimates for revenues meet the estimated expenses for the 20-year planning period, or a reassessment of the land use plan would be required. As the Urban Growth Area Guidebook points out, any analysis and reassessment, if needed, should be done before the urban growth area is adopted or reaffirmed during the GMA periodic update in order to support that UGA decision. Additionally, it may be useful to identify financing policies regarding capital facilities in writing in order to provide guidance to decision makers over time and to help inform citizens of the general methods that will be used when making choices about when and how capital facilities will be budgeted. Dave?
Yeah, this is one of the things the GMA talks a great deal about in terms of capital facilities is consistency and coordination. And we've really identified 3 different kinds of consistency that are critical in capital facilities planning. The first one is internal consistency, which basically means simply the math works. The amount and the type of growth in your capital facilities element supports the forecast in your land use element. There's general consistency between the amount and the location. This is really about how you show in your plan that you're providing adequate public facilities. Project consistency basically means that the projects that you're constructing are consistent with your overall growth strategy, and that there's a consistency between the scoping and the implementation of the project selection and the facilities that are in your capital facilities element. And intergovernmental consistency basically means consistency with neighboring jurisdictions in terms of growth projections and in terms of the amount, the location, and the phasing of development and related infrastructure. Next slide.
Okay, Dave?
So in terms of working with special purpose districts, one of the things that came up when we were developing the rule was this question of, well, how do you work with special purpose districts when they are the service provider, when you're not generally in control of your own destiny? And what kind of information do you need from them, and how do you go about getting that information? Basically, when you're working with the special purpose districts, it's important that you engage in this conversation about what is your growth strategy. Where do you see growth growing in your community, and finding out before you've made those commitments whether or not you've actually got the capacity in those areas. And in terms of the kind of information that you need from them, sometimes they've got the information in their facilities plan and sometimes they don't. What is the obligation of the jurisdiction with land use authority when they're not planning for those facilities? And what we've identified in the rule is, although you don't need to do the planning for them, there are some things that you need to do as you get the information in from the various different special purpose districts. It's important that you synthesize that information so you can show basically where it's available, that you summarize sort of what's in those different what's in those different system plans or facilities plans, especially as they relate to needs for new growth, and that you're able to have enough information in your plan to conclude that overall, when you look at all of the overlapping special purpose districts, that you can provide adequate public facilities. Next slide.
Great. And I would just add that this is really consistent with what the Capital Facilities Planning Guidebook says. So we really tried to ensure that the RCW, the WAC, and the guidebooks are very consistent with examples provided. So as far as the provisions for monitoring and evaluation go, the periodic update is a great time to bring the comprehensive plan and implementing development regulations, including the critical areas ordinance, up to current standards. But it's also an opportunity to reassess the vision and progress towards achieving the vision a community has determined for itself. Some of the basic steps include updating the inventory, assessing progress on implementation, updating the forecast and identifying any new needs, assessing your findings, and updating the implementation plan. Some of the questions to consider at this point are perhaps easy questions but not easy answers. Are we keeping up with growth? Are we falling behind in maintenance? Are we making progress on our other plans? Can we provide our urban areas with the services needed at the adopted levels of service? Are the assumptions we used during the last update still valid? And are the assumptions and timeframes of our functional plans, such as our sewer, water, and stormwater plans, especially those of other entities, are they consistent with our comprehensive plan? So those are some of the things you might want to think about as you're monitoring and evaluating your existing plan or your new plan over its lifespan. The evaluation really needs to be done in light of any new data or circumstances, such as new population figures, changes in growth patterns, any annexations or new incorporations, changes to the urban growth boundary or level of service standards, or changes in special purpose districts, whether you have new ones, any that have expanded their boundaries, or their scope of services provided. It's an excellent opportunity for educating newly elected officials or to remind your veteran officials about the importance of long-term planning for growth and the needed infrastructure to serve that growth. It's also a time to communicate with the public about the costs of the existing systems and what will be needed to implement the land use and related plans. Sorry about that. I seem to have lost audio connection to the call. Can you hear me now, Dave?
You're back on, Joyce, yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm not sure where I actually got booted out. Let's try going back to the conclusion slide, I hope. So these are some of the conclusions for capital facilities planning that came out of the guidebook research. Obviously ensuring that a jurisdiction can meet the adopted level of service with a growing population and position itself to be in order to pay for all of those things is no small feat. It's not easy, and we're not trying to imply that it is. We do recommend that jurisdictions invest where they want new growth to occur. If you have some sort of a downtown area or a mixed-use area or a center, someplace that's designated for new growth, that's where you'd want to focus a lot of your infrastructure improvements if needed. Understand how the growth pattern affects the needed investments. So when you're comparing alternatives, make sure you look at how the infrastructure costs of those alternatives play out over the years. And then remember that new residences will not necessarily increase the tax base very significantly, but they will increase the need to provide services for years to come. So really look at selecting growth and development patterns that allow for efficient and effective provision of public services. So I think most people understand that infrastructure built by others but then deeded to the public has some short and long-term costs for maintenance and operation, and eventually they will need significant repair and then eventually even replacement. So just make sure that your jurisdiction has a financial plan in place to support those expenses over time. And then before expanding the urban growth areas, consider the alternatives and costs of each. Prepare the capital facilities plan to show funding and sources needed to cover the alternatives, and then refer to the urban growth area guidebook for additional guidance in that area as well. Use that information to have candid and collaborative conversations with the public, your elected officials, other service providers, and adjacent jurisdictions. And then we recommend, of course, working collaboratively with all service providers using the same population forecasts, timeframes, assumptions based on the future land use map and the comprehensive plan. And that will help ensure that all parties are working towards the same outcomes. We have some time for Q&A. If there's any questions, you may email those to Lynn at lynn.con@commerce.wa.gov, and we'll read those, and then Dave and I will take a stab at answering those questions. And then just to let you know, we will post this webinar, the slide presentation, and any questions and answers onto our website. And this is our, at the bottom of this slide is the web address to our capital facilities page. Are there any questions at this point, Lynn? Okay, we don't have any questions coming in yet. Well, let me go ahead and give you my email address in case questions come up over the next few months as you're working on your plan updates, or a couple years for those of you who might be in Eastern Washington. And on the next slide, you'll find my contact information as well as Dave's, joyce.phillips@commerce.wa.gov. I'll be working on capital facilities issues for the next year or so. So feel free to email me questions. We'll just give a couple more minutes. It does not look like we have any questions coming in. And I know there's been a couple of technical difficulties with the webinar. Some people haven't been able to hear. So I apologize for that. We're trying to get some of these bugs worked out before we have the second hands-on capital facilities planning webinar on December 2nd. So we'll keep working to improve this link platform. Dave,
Joyce,
any comments?
We have a question about the difference between a 6-year and a 20-year capital facilities plan, and what needs to be in each. Can you discuss the relationship between the 6-year plan and the 20-year plan a bit?
Sure. Well, the 6-year plan is really the first step at identifying the improvements that are going to be made in the next 6 years and how they will be funded. The funding plan needs to be realistic and based on anticipated revenues from the jurisdiction as well as cost estimates for the projects. You should be identifying which funding sources or mix of funding sources will be used for each of the projects. Some jurisdictions actually prioritize those projects that are listed in the 6-year capital improvement plan. And the first year or two is generally tied very closely to the budget of the jurisdiction. So they need to all be in alignment to ensure that those projects can be made. Now, sometimes projects don't get built within the 6 years. They can be, typically the 6-year capital improvement plan is updated each year. Some projects will be pushed back a year or two or even more based on, growth not occurring as quickly as it had been anticipated, or other needs coming up and taking priority. So, but generally, it's the best estimate of the projects that will be needed over that 6-year time frame and how they'll be funded. Now, for years 7 to 20, it's not necessarily financially constrained in that same manner that the 6-year capital improvement plan is, but it is really a look at this is the set of improvements I'm going to need to implement the vision and goals and policies of my comprehensive plan. It's going to cover everything from water, sewer, stormwater, any kinds of those capital improvements that are noted in the plan, and then it's going to have an estimate of what those kinds of projects are going to cost and how they're going to be paid for. It doesn't have to be as technically accurate as the 6-year plan, but it really needs to show that you have a good solid basis of what's needed and how it's going to be paid for. And it may mean that you need to look at, if you need to prolong some of those costs, you might start looking at asset management or demand management types of programs, or you might start looking for grant funding sooner if you need to get some of those projects in the works. But it's not as technically constrained as the 6-year capital improvement plan, but it is that big look at understanding what you need as well as how you're going to pay for implementing those projects. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that, Dave?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about what is the purpose of the 20-year plan versus the 6-year plan, as you said, the 6-year plan has a lot to do with the budgeting process, and there's a lot of what goes on in there is the sort of the obligation process, where you've identified plans and you're picking the plans off of your 20-year list to put into the 6-year plan based on the projects that are ready to go forward right now. When you've got an identified funding source, it's really a current law funding source. But there's this fundamental question of in the Growth Management Act of whether or not your capital facilities provision is keeping up with need. Well, what is the need that you're supposed to be keeping up with? That's really what the 20-year plan identifies. It's that connection between our growth strategy and the capital facilities we'll need for that. So that's what you're measuring against, is whether or not you're keeping up with that. And that will tell you whether or not you're catching up, or whether you're keeping up with those, or whether or not you're falling behind. Those will also indicate, because you've identified needs and you've got a general sense of funding, whether or not you're going to need to go seek out new sources of revenue, or whether you're going to look at new regulations internally that are going to be able to provide that. So when your plan, so if your 20-year plan is out of balance, you've got an opportunity then to catch that up far enough ahead that you can make some meaningful changes, so that when you get to the 6-year plan, you're really more in a programming and budgeting mode. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and I think it's true that you really need to have that big look ahead, but also be thinking about the current situation as well. And I think that's why things change over time. Either funding or revenue doesn't come through the way that you thought it might, or growth doesn't occur exactly where you thought it would, and you need to kind of shift where your improvements are going to go based on changes. And I think that's where the periodic update can come into being a fairly significant tool that you're looking at to provide those services. I'm also going to run through the slide deck real quick and get to that last slide again. Dave, we did get another question in. It says city or county plans, capital facilities, and unincorporated UGAs. So do you want to talk about kind of that unincorporated UGA portion of a municipal UGA?
Yeah. These are, I'm assuming the question is who's responsible for planning if you've got a municipally identified urban growth area, but it's unincorporated. Generally speaking, if the city is going to be annexing that area, and if it's been identified as a future annexation area, it really depends. If the city is a service provider, if there's a city water or a city sewer utility, and if the city, especially if the city has requested this area to be added, their plans should generally show for the areas they intend to annex what the capital facilities plans for those areas are going to be. That said, when the county is adopting an urban growth area, and they're the ones who are, and it is a county plan, and it's showing in their land use element, so they do have an obligation to assure that somebody is planning for all of the facilities in those areas, be that the city that's ultimately going to annex it, or special purpose districts that are responsible for perhaps providing water service or sewer service. But generally speaking, the person that has the planning authority for that area is responsible for assuring that their capital facilities element has identified the full range of adequate public facilities. That may mean that there's some pointing back to a city comprehensive plan capital facilities element, or it could be that there's a pointing back to information that they have received from another service provider. So the answer to that question is really specific to the type of facility that's being provided and who in their plans is ultimately responsible for providing that service. You may have an area where there is no one who's identified as responsible for providing that service. And if the county is adopting a land use element that has urban development in this area, then it's ultimately responsible for assuring that there is some provision of adequate public facilities. It really comes back to the requirement that you're providing sufficient capacity of land suitable for development. And part of that is the zoning, but part of it is also the capital facilities provision that is required before someone can actually pull a permit at the zones that you've established, at the densities that you've established for them in your land use element.
Great. And I think that also gets back to the consistency slide that we showed. Especially for counties, if they're not the providers of the services themselves, they really need to take a look at, what the city or other service providers has and is planning for those urban growth areas. And that's where that internal consistency is vitally important. Okay. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we received another question about the benefits of developing a capital facilities plan that meets the GMA standards versus one that doesn't for a fire district. Apparently, we have someone whose fire district is considering doing a capital facilities plan, but doesn't believe that plan needs to maintain any consistency with the GMA. And a lot of this, especially, would come back to whether or not there's going to be an impact fee. If you've identified areas that are necessary for growth, and if so, then there needs to be some, if they're going to be asking for any kind of mitigation for new growth, then of course they would need to be able to supply the city or the county with land use authority with enough information that they can show that there is this necessary connection between the facilities that they need for providing fire service and that this is actually resulting from growth. That's why you would do a capital facilities plan for a fire district, and that's one of the things that they get out of it. Is it's going to be much more easy to demonstrate that, yeah, provision of fire service, this is something that's actually resulting from this new growth. So if the fire district has any plans to try to get revenue or mitigation for the demands, they better be able to show how what they are providing and what they need in terms of capital facilities is resulting from growth, and that's generally going to be a GMA capital facilities plan.
Agreed. Yeah, that's a great point, Dave. And I think the other point is, again, that gets back to the consistency. If the fire department wants the jurisdiction to be able to collect mitigation fees or request mitigation fees on their behalf, they need to provide adequate information to the city or the county to make those determinations that they have enough information to know what it is that they're asking for and why, and that they can justify that. Alternatively, if that's not the goal of the fire department, it still just helps to build those relationships and have the city and county and the fire districts working together, regardless of the specificity of how that's going to be used. Okay, are you getting any other questions, Dave?
That's the last one I have right now in chat log.
Okay. And we have no more additional questions here on this end. So thank you, everybody, for attending the webinar. We'll try to get some of the technical bugs worked out before we have the next one on December 2nd. We'll be sending out some sort of an invite to that webinar in the next week or so. Thank you all for your participation, and we hope that this was helpful. Thanks. Bye-bye.